días a todos quienes nos acompañan esta mañana. Gracias por acompañarnos en nuestra conferencia internacional la salud mental e inteligencia socio-emocional, el cerebro, el apego y la resiliencia en niños y adolescentes. La organización de esta actividad es producto de la colaboración entre la Facultad de Psicología de UD, la Universidad de Talca y la Sociedad Chilena de Desarrollo Emocional. Cuenta además con financiamiento de ANIT a través de un proyecto de investigación Fondesit a cargo de investigadores de estas instituciones. Con esta actividad damos además inicio a otro proyecto Fondesit enfocado en el estudio de la asociación entre patrones de apego y oxitocina, en el que participan el doctor Jaime Silva y la doctora Daniela Luney de la Universidad de Desarrollo, la doctora Rosario Spencer de la Universidad de Talca, el doctor Rodrigo Cárcamo de la Universidad de Magallanes y el doctor Manuel Ortiz de la Universidad de la Frontera. En esta oportunidad tenemos el honor de contar con la participación del doctor Daniel Stiegler, quien es profesor de psiquiatría en la Escuela de Medicina de la Universidad de California en Los Ángeles, y el fundador y codirector del Mindful Awareness Research Center de la misma universidad. El Dr. Stiegler es además director ejecutivo del Instituto Mindsight, enfocado en el desarrollo de la mentalización y que ofrece actividades para promover estabilidad en individuos y familias. Como ustedes probablemente ya saben, el Dr. Stiegler ha publicado numerosos libros, tanto para profesionales como para el público general, que han tenido amplia difusión en distintos países. A partir de su experiencia, es editor fundador de la Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology, que cuenta actualmente con más de 70 libros de texto. Para aquellos que nos acompañan por Zoom esta mañana, les recordamos que esta presentación cuenta con traducción simultánea para aquellos que están online. Para acceder a ella, tienen que hacer clic en la barra inferior en su pantalla, en el icono de mundo y seleccionar el idioma correspondiente. Le damos entonces la bienvenida a nuestro invitado, Dr. Stiegler. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're delighted about your visit and very eager to listen to your talk. So please, you can start. Thank you very much.
Very much for that introduction, and thank you for having us here. Can you hear me okay in the back? And for the translation online, I'll try to speak despacio, si es posible, porque tengo mucha energía para las tópicas que vamos a hablar. Buenos días. I wish I could do the whole talk in Spanish, but I can't. It's hard enough to do it in English. So we'll try to have time for questions, but let me just find out from those of you who are here, how many of you are doing studies that involve the development of the mind? Can you raise your hand? Okay. And how many are working in the area of mental health? Okay, so many other people. And how many more broadly are working in something that has to do with the human mind? Is that everyone? Yeah, okay. So today's talk will be about social and emotional well-being and mental health. And we're going to look at issues related to children and adolescents. But most adults that I know used to be children and adolescents. So this would actually relate to everyone. And as you heard in my background, I was trained initially in biology in college, and I studied chemistry, and then I went on to study medicine, and then specialized in pediatrics to study children, and then worked in the area of psychiatry with adults and adolescents and children, and then I decided to become a researcher studying attachment, las relaciones entre los niños y los padres. And in studying attachment, what was very interesting is that we have, is this one okay? It's coming and going. We have this opportunity to look specifically at communication and the way a relationship early in life can set the stage for social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and mental health for the rest of one's life. So for me, that was a very interesting opportunity to see the science of relationships and how that would allow us to understand more broadly what relationships are. So after I was trained in that field of attachment, which we'll talk a lot about today, I was asked to be the training director in child and adolescent psychiatry for anyone at UCLA who was working with children or adolescents. So I took a deep breath and I thought about it, and I realized that people who were teaching me never told me what the mind was. And it was like a bit of a shock because I was finished with my formal training and I was asked to be the teacher, but then I almost felt confused. You know, why didn't someone say what the mind was? So I'll ask you, because for me, the answer would be no to this question. In your training in areas related to mental health or mental disorder or mental development, has anyone defined what the mind is? Okay, so I don't know if people on Zoom can see, but 0 people are raising hands, and that would be for me too. And I asked people around the world this, so just so you know. So I've asked over 100,000 people working in the field of mental well-being, mental health, and it's about 2 to 5% ever say yes. So that's 95 to 98% also say no. But then when you have time and someone says, yes, someone told me, and you say, okay, what is the mind? What we've told, they say the mind is your thoughts and your feelings, which is a description, not a definition. So then I said, fine. You know, what is a sentimiento? ¿Qué es una pensamiento? You know, what's a thought? What's a feeling? And then they go, well, a feeling is what you have when you feel something. And I go, okay, and then what's a thought? Like this little baby that just came in. ¿Qué edad tiene?
7 meses.
Okay. 7 meses. Wow, okay, that's an incredible time. ¿Y cómo se llama?
Clemente.
Clemente, ok. Hola, Clemente. ¿Cómo estás? Tito. Clemente. Hola. ¿Cómo estás? Okay, so at 7 months, right, he's going to develop, because he's crawling, you know, a concern about being away from his father. And around someone he doesn't know. So he's like, you're not my dad. I'm not going to get out of this little carrier. So when we think about his thoughts and his feelings, they might be different from, you know, when he's 17 versus when he's 7 months, right? So we want to honor that people have been describing the mind in psychology, psychiatry, social work, all the fields that involve looking at development. But interestingly, not only is the mind not defined, but I once had the opportunity to meet with one of the most esteemed professors of psychology, who I really love. We were having dinner with a bunch of other psychologists and psychiatrists. So I just said to him, you know, I love your work. And he said, thank you very much. And we had met years before. And I said, do you have a definition of the mind? He's 85 years old. 85 años. He said, no, I got to practice my Spanish. I know you understand. So he says, what? I said, well, you're like the most esteemed professor of psychology. Do you have a definition of the mind? And he goes, I've never thought of that. I said, well, do you? He goes, no, I don't. So we ended up talking about what I'm going to say now. So when we think about Clemente and how Clemente is going to develop, his way of communicating with his mother and with his father are going to shape his mind. But while we can say that, it doesn't have that much meaning if we haven't said what the mind is, does it? Mm-hmm. So this was back in, we're talking about 1990. So many years ago, it was the beginning of the decade of the brain. And so I brought many of my teachers into a room together, 40 of them, to ask the question to begin with, what is the mind? And what is the brain? And what do they have to do with each other? And then the next set of questions, once we can answer that question, what is the mind? And then its connected question, what is the brain? Is what is a healthy mind and what is a healthy brain? Does that make sense? Okay. So, so this is where having what in contemplative practice we call a beginner's mind is so helpful to have. A beginner's mind is a phrase about how to be really present for what's going on. And I've just got to say, I'm honored because the executive, the head of our organization, the Mindsight Institute, is here. My work partner, Caroline Welch, there, and she wrote a beautiful book called The Gift of Presence, which kind of walks you through what does it mean to be present. So I'm honored that you're here with your presence. And in being present, in a way, you let go of your expectations and judgments. So I'm going to ask you to give yourself the gift of presence right now. To say, okay, well, in this class I learned this, in that class I learned that. In my own experience, I learned something else. Now, just to drop into a simple thing, and let's think about today and say, what's happening now and between his mother and him, right there? And usted está la madre y el padre, I want to make sure. Yeah. They could be actually my brother and sister who came in and we just grabbed the baby. But no, this is the thing. So now Clemente is going to have an experience right now. And if we look at that, we want to take a beginner's mind to really looking at that, right? So what do you think is going on now between Clemente? Take a look at Clemente and his mom and Clemente and his dad. What's actually happening? I think we can all agree that something that's going on is going to shape how Clemente would be when he's 27, right? And the research would support that, right? So what exactly is it? So the fifth attachment tries to address that by asking that question without saying what the mind is. But we're going to start with what the mind is because I think it gets you deeper to then saying what's a healthy mind. Okay, so what is going on between Clemente and his parents? At the most basic level, what do you see? Okay? So what's the word? Trust. So there's an emotional state of trust. Excellent. So you can feel in the way the three of them are interacting, there's a sense of trust. Okay, what else do you see? Co-regulation. Co-regulation. Yeah, and so there's something, the co of co-regulation is there's something happening that's shared, that's the co part, it's mutual, and something about regulating something, which regulation, interestingly, has two parts to it. It's you have to monitor something and then you have to modify something. So there's a monitoring going on of something, we didn't say what it is, but then a modifying of that something, right? So if you regulate a bicycle, you are going to monitor where the bike is going with your eyes. You're going to listen to what's going on around you with your ears. You're going to feel the balance of the bike with your balance. And then you're going to not only monitor it, but you're going to modify how fast you go, when you stop, how you balance the bike. So co-regulation is a great word because it says there's something happening in the betweenness, and there's something happening in the monitoring and modifying. Right? But we haven't said what it is that is monitoring, modifying. What do you see with Clemente and his parents? And he feels secure. So there's a feeling state, which we haven't defined what that is, but there's a sense of the tone of lived experience. That's the simplest way of defining a feeling. Not so much an emotion, which is a little different from a feeling, but a feeling that is happening right there of security. And but we haven't said what security is yet, but we get a sense of that. Okay, anything else you notice? Yes? There's the flow of energy and information. Beautiful. Okay, so let's look at that. So if we go to beneath the idea of co-regulation and trust, we then say there's a flow of something, meaning something is changing. Moment by moment it's changing. And then we can also say that it's energy and information. So take a look at what his dad is doing with him right now. Don't get self-conscious, just keep on doing it. So even though he has a mask on, you can see Clemente is sharing energy in the form of photons. Photons, right, with light. And they're just looking at each other, right? And some of the light that's being shared is symbolic if they start using certain communication signals. Some of it is just pure energy. So if I go like that, you know, that would be pure energy. But if I say, like I did, good morning, and I said his name, Clemente, you know, he turned to see me because that had information in it. So information is a pattern of energy with symbolic value. So some physicists would say the most fundamental aspect of reality is energy. Other physicists would say the most fundamental aspect of the universe is information. And for those people, energy comes from information, but for the other folks, energy is what gives rise to information. So if you just put them together, you make both sets of physicists happy. So we're going to use the phrase, the flow of energy and information. So in this group of scientists in 1991 that were gathered, you know, they couldn't decide what the mind was. No one had a definition of the mind. But when I came back, when they were having a lot of disagreements, and I said, well, the anthropologists that were gathered there, they were studying energy and information flow in a culture. So here in Chile, you have a new president yesterday, you know, who will bring his own way of bringing energy and information flow into the way people communicate with each other in the society here. That's called culture. So you may see changes in the culture with a change in a president that you elected. You can see these changes in a group. In this group, you know, if I were up here saying, thank you very much for inviting me to come here to Santiago. I am going to tell, you know, if like that, it would be a very different kind of feeling in the room. So you get a feeling in the room, as a sociologist would study, and they don't speak like this, but you could call it energy and information that was in the room, right, for a sociologist. And for an attachment researcher like myself, it would be just what we're saying, is it's energy information that's being shared. But I want to just tell you that attachment researchers don't talk like that. In fact, my interns and I could find no one that talked like that in any field. So I'm a very doubting person, so it may be completely wrong what we're about to say. But for me, for the last 30 years, looking at that relationship as a sharing of energy and information flow, that's how we're going to define a relationship, you know, allowed us back in 1991 to say that anthropologists look at the relational sharing in a, you know, in a culture, sociologists in a group, linguistics experts in how we speak to each other, but a brain expert is the same thing inside the body. Usually they study just what's happening in the brain, in the head, and that's energy and information flow patterns inside the skull. So here's our first stopping point about the beginner's mind, is that we often think the skull and the skin are some kind of impermeable boundaries that are somehow defining something. But energy and information flow. Is this running out of battery or is it okay? But is there another option? Oh, you call it. Yeah. So energy and information flow, like when this runs out of energy, the information won't get to you. Or if I just, you would stop having. So you need energy to get the information flow. So the skull does not block energy and information from flowing. The skin does not block energy and information from flowing. So I get a lot of resistance from people in my original field, psychiatry or neuroscience, that say the mind is what the brain does in the head. And I say that's part of a much bigger story. And they go, you're wrong. We've proven the mind is just brain activity. And so, do you want to? Here we go. So the issue then is for some scientists who are very dedicated to what they're doing, they are staying with what Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago, and the father of modern medicine, grandfather of modern medicine, and also William James reaffirmed, mind is what brain does. Very common. It's what I was taught in medical school. And what I'm saying to you is that's partly true, that the mind is not the same as the brain or the brain's activity. But there are many people who disagree with me. I just want to protect you. If you go to a party tonight with some people from neuroscience and you say, oh, this is what I think the mind is, we haven't said what it is yet, but they can get very upset with a view that extends the mind beyond the individual in the body. Okay, so when you do spend a lot of time with babies and their parents, like I've given the chance to do, you realize the mind is relational. I mean, it's kind of obvious. So even though I'm trained as a biochemist and I study molecules and all that stuff, there's something happening in the betweenness. And it's wonderful, but it's not magical. That is, it's not something we're just making up. It's a true thing. And you can't see it with your eyes. So for me, I made up a word which doesn't really have a Spanish translation called mindsight, which was my professors in medical school could come to a person and say, oh, I've done these tests and I'm going to do this diagnosis. You're going to die in 3 months. And they'd walk away. And I would say, don't you want to go back and talk to them? They go, why? And they would not see that the person had subjective experience. So let's go through 4 facets of the mind that Clemente has. Now he's looking at me. Hi. Hola. ¿Qué tal? So Clemente has got subjective experience, number 1. So subjective experience is the felt texture of life that most likely all animals have. You might even describe it in plants. I mean, it's just what it means to be what you are, with the feeling of what you are. That cannot be reduced to the brain. I used to work on a suicide prevention service. If someone called on the phone and said, I think I'm going to kill myself, I've got this gun, there's no future for me, life is terrible. And if I said to them, oh, the serotonin levels in your prefrontal cortex are probably so low, boom, they would kill themselves. But if I said, oh, wow, that sounds so painful to be feeling such despair, tell me more about it. That's a whole different experience where a person feels felt. Because as a listener, I identify their subjective experience. I'm not just saying what's going on in the brain. Even if it's 100% dependent on the brain, it's not the same as the brain. So, this is an extremely important issue. Subjective experience is the first facet of the mind that tells us the mind is not the same as the brain, even if it's completely dependent on what happens in the brain. The second aspect of mind that we need to talk about is consciousness, right? Yes, Clemente. So, he likes consciousness. So with consciousness, you have this issue of knowing what your subjective experience is. So experience by itself, let's say, is energy flow. Anytime you use the word experience, you could replace that word with a definition. Experience is energy flow. Sometimes it has information, sometimes it doesn't. But you don't know you're having energy flow unless you have consciousness. So that's kind of a really important aspect of knowing that we have this experience. So I have to be conscious of this microphone. So if the energy goes out of the microphone, then inside of this body, I gotta just be aware that you're not actually hearing something that may have come out of my mouth. So I need to then say it again or something like that. So even right in this experience, you can see where I've gotta monitor with consciousness what's going on and modify it so that the relational experience we have is a shared flowing, right, of energy and information. Okay, the third facet of mind is the one that's most commonly used in cognitive science, which is information processing. And information processing is basically how you extract from patterns of energy symbolic meaning in increasing layers of complexity. And so you see this on the internet, for example. The human mind is manifesting itself outside of its skin encased boundaries of the body, or certainly the skull encased boundaries of the skin of the skull, so that you have this web of an interconnected mind. Oh, is it? You think it's not this, but it's the distance from something. We'll try this. So maybe it's the distance. So let's see. Okay. Good. All right. So now he is so cute. Clemente, you want to come teach the class with me up here? Yes, I do. You're not making any sense. Okay. So information processing in cognitive science, it's the cognitive scientists use 4 E's. Cuatro palabras que empieza con E. So la primera E is embodied. So embodied means, you actually are having information processing that's coming from a body, and it's in a body. So in English, I don't know if in Spanish it would be like this way, but in English we have a word understanding, right? Comprendo, right? But understanding in English means to stand under. I don't know if that doesn't mean that way in Spanish, does it? Comprendo. But in English it's understand. So I'm literally standing underneath something, so I understand it, right? So it's up here, so I've got it. I've made sense of it. Or in English, we have a word grasp. Do you have that word in Spanish? No. So like to grasp, like I'm grasping this. Right. So, but we also have the same meaning for to understand a concept. Did you grasp what I was saying? Right? So that would be both embodied and enacted, right? Like that. So, even with theoretical things, we get our bodies into it. So enacted is the first, second E. First is embodied, second E is enacted. But those are all having to do with the individual, right? But then information processing goes beyond the individual when you are now experiencing the extension of information processing, like when you're taking notes on a piece of paper. You're extending it beyond the body, or obviously a computer, or a smartphone, or the libraries when you write books. You're extending your information processing beyond the body. So this is what cognitive science tells us. And the fourth E is embedded. Embedded in culture, for example. So you can walk in a room, let's say a classroom, and you can feel the culture the teacher has created. I thought that was a baby, but I couldn't see her head. ¿Qué edad tiene esto? 2 meses. Okay, wait. Here's a friend. Una niña. ¿Cómo se llama? Elisa. Okay, Elisa. Esto es Clemente. Clemente, Elisa. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't know maybe you had something else in there, but great. So Elisa and Clemente, that's fantastic. Our main teachers. ¿Y la primera para usted? El segundo. ¿Y para ellos? Número uno. Okay, great. So, ¿qué edad tiene la otra? 3. ¿Un hijo o hija? Also Clemente? Oh my God. Great, okay. 2 Clementes, 1 Elisa. Okay, great. So, in the idea of being embedded is you can walk in a classroom and you can feel what some of my colleagues at MIT, Peter Senge and Mette Bold and Otto Sharma, these are the people I work with there, we call a relational field, right? A relational field. And they don't talk like this, but I do. I think a relational field is energy and information flow, patterns of sharing energy information flow that are quickly set up and you can feel it in a classroom. And some classrooms promote creativity and collaboration and compassion and connection, you know, and some inhibit that. And they make it competitive and people are frightened and there's no trust. So we can also apply a relational field to what's called a dyad, right? D-Y-A-D, a dyad is a pair, right? And diada. Diada? A or O? Diada. Yeah, so diada, you know, a pair is how do you say field in Spanish? A campo, that's nice. A campo relacional. Yeah, so a relational field, for me, you know, even when I talk with my colleagues at MIT, they don't use the phrase energy and information flow. They never talk like that. But for me, what a relational field is energy and information flow. And you can see it in a classroom, you can see it in a dialogue, so now we're defining it as an energy and information flow field, but that doesn't tell us what the mind is yet. But we're describing these aspects of, you know, subjective experience, consciousness, information processing. Now we're going to come to the 4th facet of mind. And in looking at this 4th facet, we're going to spend the rest of our time really talking about this 4th facet of mind. Because for me, when these 3 facets became really clear as descriptions, nothing about them logically told you what a healthy mind could be. Because if you say the mind is subjective experience, you go, okay, who cares? What am I to do with that? You say, well, a healthy mind is healthy subjective experience. So you go, well, what is healthy subjective experience? Well, you're always happy, no? You could be sad, or you could be mad. I mean, there's lots of subjective, so nothing about subjective experience. Consciousness, what would you say? Well, consciousness is healthy when it's, what? Nothing. Consciousness is just your awareness of subjective experience. So that doesn't help. Information processing, there's lots of different culturally sensitive ways we have information processing. So nothing about that says what's healthy or not. So there's a long story that I wrote in a book, I think that's translated to Spanish. In English, it's called Mind. In Spanish, it'll be La Mente. La or El? La. La Mente. I don't know what you're doing with your masculine and feminine now, because in the United States, that doesn't fly. Are you getting rid of it? Here? No. It's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, so anyway, that, in English, we don't have that exact problem because we don't have the feminine and masculine. Okay, so La Mente it's a libro. It's a book that talks about how these ideas came up. So I'm just going to summarize it very briefly. But when I was a therapist, I noticed, and I'll ask you, how many of you are actually therapists? Well, many people, okay. So have you noticed that if you take a step back and take beginner's mind, that, at least what I noticed, that people came with suffering, sufrimiento, sufrimiento, que fue de chaos or rigidity. ¿Cómo se dice rigidity? Rigidez. So rigidity or chaos. Rigidity would be something closed down, completely predictable, unchanging, right? Inflexible. That's rigidity. Chaos, on the other hand, was, unpredictable, changing all the time, out of control, like that. Have you ever noticed that? So I noticed it, and I would say to my supervisors, there may be something wrong with me, but I know there's the diagnostic and statistical manual of all these disorders, but beneath all that seems to be either chaos or rigidity, and their eyes would go, what did you say? I said, well, everyone seems to come with chaos, rigidity, or both, like someone with manic depressive illness, mediums full of chaos, depression full of rigidity. Someone with schizophrenia, right? You can have them with rigid delusions or chaotic hallucinations, right? And you can put that aside, but let's look at disorders that are caused by, not like those two, but caused by trauma, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder is chaos and rigidity, right? Intrusive memories, intrusive emotional states, that come from inside the body, and rigidity of withdrawal that are like what happened before. And so it didn't matter the cause, people seemed to come with rigidity or chaos. So then I pulled out the DSM-3 at the time, and I went through every syndrome and reinterpreted every syndrome for me. Every symptom of every syndrome was chaos or rigidity. So I would ask my supervisors, do you notice that? They go, no. I go, maybe I'm just I'm lazy, right? I don't want to learn the DSM because there's so many things to memorize. Maybe I just want to memorize chaos or rigidity as 2 things and I'm done. They go, maybe, and I go, whatever. So I don't know. So in looking at this question of what the mind is, I thought about my training in how Alicia is relating to her mom, or Clemente is relating to his parents. And what you see when you look at these parents with their babies is a system. So luckily in the 1980s, a bunch of scientists from various fields were getting together, mathematics and physics, and they began to study systems. So a system is defined as a collection of either events or entities that are interacting with each other. And in particular, if a system has 3 qualities to it, and I want to ask you about your life and your mental life in particular, these 3 qualities define a certain kind of system. One is the system open? So open means stuff. It could be energy, information, or condensed energy is matter, right? So even matter is energy, as you know. So it could be basically open to being influenced by stuff outside of itself. So when I say stuff, is there a Spanish word for stuff? Cosas, pero cosas is an entity, right? Like a thing. This also means like activities, actividades y cosas. That means stuff. So the stuff, it's a general word in English that just means like the essence of something, the stuff of the mind, right? So we're saying the stuff of the mind is energy and information flow. And it turns out that when you look at this way of a system having stuff, it can be things or activities, cosas or actividades. And being open means stuff from outside of what you call you influences you. How many think you're open? Part of an open system. Okay, all right, so that's criteria number one. Criteria number two is, are you capable of being chaotic? Anybody have a very unpredictable day? Anybody ever have an unpredictable day? So if you're capable of being chaotic, that's the second criteria. And the third criteria, it's the most important, is something in English, I don't know what it would be in Spanish, is non-linear. Non-linear. Okay, so non-linear is a small thing happens early in the day and a very huge result that is almost impossible to predict comes out. That's called nonlinear. So if you are how many think you're nonlinear? Anybody think you're part of a nonlinear system? Raise your hand really high so we can see. Okay, so only half. Okay, so if you are a nonlinear, chaos-capable, open system, the formal name for you is a complex system. Complex. Now, in English, it's very important to distinguish, I don't know if this is true in Spanish, between the word complex and complicated. They're totally different. Complex systems are really simple. Complicated just means, oh, it's just too much. But complexity is not the same as complicatedness. So a complex system, it turns out, in our universe, has something called emergence. Emergence. In Spanish, what would that be? Emergente. But it's not an emergency. No, okay. How do you say emergency? Oh, emergencia. Okay, so it's similar like that. So emergente, is that right? Yeah, okay, so emergent is a word that for some scientists, they roll their eyes and they make fun of you and even say really bad things in their publications about you. Because if you are a scientist who's not trained in systems thinking, which is only from the 1980s, so it's new, then you think the idea that something that's greater than the individual parts is what emergence is. Something is arising from the interaction of the stuff of the system that is more than the individual components. So I'm reading this about emergence, and I said, well, this is amazing. I said, what if subjective experience is an emergent property of energy flow? That'd be amazing. Like wetness is an emergent property of water. If you get the H2O molecule, it's not wet. But if you put a bunch of H2O molecules together, that's wet, right? So if someone says, well, there's no such thing as wetness, then they've never jumped in a lake, right? So wetness then is a property of emergence of this complex system called water. So subjective experience might be an emergent property of energy flow. Consciousness, that we'll talk about in a little bit, it could be an emergent property of energy flow. Information processing, we've already defined, is an emergent property of energy flow, energy and information flow. So then, if you read the research on complex systems, one of the emergent properties of complex systems, which we've already agreed many of us would be a part of, is called self-organization. And I started reading about this, and I couldn't believe what the mathematics was saying, was that complex systems have an innate, built-in capacity to regulate their own development and becoming. Self-organization is the emergent property of complex systems in which the unfolding, the flow of the complex system will be shaped by an innate process to this complex system. So I read that and I said, oh my God, let me learn more about it. And here's what I read. Optimal self-organization creates harmony, essentially, where it has 5 features that in English, fortunately, can spell the word faces, F-A-C-E-S. Flexible is the F, adaptive is the A, coherent is the C, energized is the E, and stable, meaning reliable, is the S. So optimal self-organization allows this harmony to unfold with these 5 characteristics. It's flexible, meaning it can bend and not break. It's adaptive, meaning it learns from what's going on. It learns. These are learning systems, and it adapts in the best way it can. Coherent is a mathematical term for essentially resilient over time. Coherent, coherencia, yeah. Coherent, is that it? Yeah, okay. Energy is energía, y stable is estable? Yes, stabilidad, yeah. So I'm going, oh my God, that's like the best definition of mental health I've ever seen. But actually it was the only definition of anything like mental health I'd ever seen. But this made me think, what if the 4th facet of mind could be defined this way? You ready? I'll do it in English and then we'll try to do it in Spanish. The 4th facet of mind, so we have the first is subjective experience, the second is consciousness, the third is information processing. Fine. Now we're doing the 4th. And those are kind of descriptions. This one's a definition. The emergent, self-organizing, and here's the part that really, I think, makes this definition so useful. Embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Bless you. Bless you. So let's go over it again, and let's do each one in Spanish. I don't know if the order will be the same. So the emergent, la emergente, relational, embodied, how do you say that? Encarnada, okay. Y relacional, que está regulando, que regula the flow of energy and information. How do you say that? El flujo de energía y información. Okay, so a couple of key aspects of this definition of the mind are the mind is a verb, not a noun, right? It's an action, it's not a thing. The second thing we talked about is it's embodied and relational. And what's so interesting about this definition from a practical point of view as a therapist is when self-organization is optimal, you get the faces flow of harmony. But if you're drawing on your piece of paper, maybe I can do it. Let's see how it works with a microphone. Can I draw on this? Yeah. Okay. So here we have the faces flow. Armonía. So, este es el flujo, la fluja de harmony, okay? If this is like a river, like a rio, then one bank outside of the river is chaos. the other bank outside of the word rigidity. And this is what the mathematics of complex systems says. And back in 1991, when I read this from the research in the 1980s, I looked at it, well, they didn't have this, but I drew this, and to me, this explained the entire field of mental health. That optimal self-organization was health. And when you impaired it, you got either chaos or you got rigidity, no matter the cause. So does this make sense so far? So the proposal in 1992 was the mind, let's say it in Spanish. What's the definition of the mind, the fourth facet? The emergence. So you say it in Spanish, I'll say it in English. The emergence. With emergent and self-organizational, oh, we forgot that one. Self-organizing, embodied, what do you say self-organizing in Spanish? Auto-organizada. And then we have embodied, encarnada, y relacional, relational process that's regulating the flow of energy information, right? Okay, so right now, if we look at Clemente and his dad, he's getting a little oopsie because he's probably going to take a nap. Right? So you can see that his mom and his dad are very sensitive to his expression of energy and information flow. Now, they are very much present for him. They're attuned, meaning they're focusing their attention on what his internal energy information flow state is, his subjective experience, right? They're resonating with that so they can feel a little restless too, right? You can see from his dad. And that's trust. And that's an acronym in English that spells the word PART, P-A-R-T. They're present, attune, resonate, and that's where trust comes from. So they'll probably fall asleep in about 3 minutes, don't you think? 3 minutos para dormir? No. Okay, look at those legs going. Okay, so now you might ask the question, okay, big deal, then how do I use this in therapy? So the next question would be, if this is true, that this is actually a diagram that represents the whole field of mental health. How do you get this flow? And it turns out there's an answer from mathematics of complex systems. And the answer is you differentiate and you link. Right? So differentiation is a word in English that means things are allowed to be different. It's like that. And you take the differences and then you link them. How do you say linkage? You say what linkage? Link para conectar? Again? With vincular? Oh, with an F-A? A V. Vincular. Vincular. Okay. So you do that. And the key thing is that linkage, you do not lose the differentiation. So in English, we have a word blending. Like when you put something in a blender and you make it homogeneous. This is not blending. Now, in mathematics, when things are differentiated and linked, it's how you create optimal self-organization. So that's the answer. This is what leads to that. That's that flow. Now, in English, there's no word that summarizes this in math, but as a teacher, I needed a word. So I added a word for what this could be called, but in mathematics, they don't use it that way. I use the word integration. Integración. But mathematicians don't use that way. They use it a different way. But that's how we're going to use the word integration. So our is that integration is what leads to that. This is also what we're saying is that health is created by integration. So here's what I'll say, a very simple thing. Clemente left the room, but where is he? But secure attachment comes from relational integration. What do I mean by that? Clemente or Elisa, they can be their different selves, but then the parent links to them, right? So that would be an integrated relationship. Now, we once had a week-long meeting of attachment researchers from around the world, and none of them used the word integration. None of them used the concept of information flow. So again, it could all be wrong because it isn't the way people talk. So when they had me give a talk to the researchers gathered there, I said this simple statement. Cuando la madre de Alicia es when she's differentiated from her daughter, and the daughter experiences that her differences are being honored, and she's being linked by her mother being present, attuned, and having resonance, so she experiences trust, that part. Her brain, Alicia's brain, will become integrated. And forms of non-secure attachment, called insecure attachment, are all examples of impaired relational integration, and they have impaired integration in the brain, would be the theory. So to say it very simply, the development of the human brain depends on the relational integration that's present or not, and that if it's not present, the brain will not develop the integration it needs. Now, for some children, they develop impaired integration in childhood and adolescence because of what their parents do. For other children, they develop impaired integration because of genetic issues, no matter what their parents do. So in our field, we have this proposal from 30 years ago that impaired integration relationally and impaired integration in the brain will go hand in hand. So we won't work about causation. So let's talk about the research to support this. So let's begin with a disorder that is not caused by what parents do. In manic depressive illness, should I wait for this? Is this coming and going? Right? Here in the Zoom.
We're trying to change the battery.
Yeah.
They're coming.
So let me see if there are questions. Let's do a few questions right now. Maybe we'll get the batteries. Preguntas so far. Sí.
I have a question about what's the R in the abbreviation psychosis.
Resonance. Resonance is, how do you say that in Spanish? Resonance would be like guitar strings, 6 guitar strings, right? You pluck one, the other is affected by the other string, but it doesn't become the other string. Para resonar? Yeah. So to resonate. So it's very different from mirroring, you know, resonating. And resonance is such a great term in music. It feels very good to use it in our therapeutic relationships, our parent-child relationships. And also, it's important as therapists, we don't become our patients. or else we will burn out. So we have to maintain differentiation and establish linkage. We don't become our patients. We will stop being able to function. Okay, any other preguntas? Does it make sense? Okay, all right, so let's look at some of the research data. Now, it's very important to say that in the 1950s, child mental health made statements that came from really good hearts, that were really bad things they said, that made people feel terrible and that were useless. So in the field of child mental health and child psychopathology, even though there were well-intended researchers and well-intended clinicians, they did a lot of harm. So we want to acknowledge that. Let's give, can anyone one example of that? Autism. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, so for a long time, if a child had autism, what were the parents told was the reason they had autism? No, this is before that. They were told the mother was acting like a refrigerator. Totally not true. But if you had a child who's having difficulty with sensory integration, difficulty with emotion regulation, difficulty with social cognition, you were told it was your fault. So let's think of another example where parents were told that. Any other example?
With schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia, exactly. So with schizophrenia, people have the positive symptoms of hallucinations and delusions and the negative symptoms of withdrawal from society and just anhedonia, not feeling pleasure. And with schizophrenia, we have that in 1% of the population throughout the world, right? And here in the southern hemisphere, you have people tend to be born in a 6-month period, and in the northern hemisphere with the other 6-month period. So what does that birthday correlation make you think? Seasonal somehow. And what's seasonal?
Virus.
A virus, exactly. So then, you know, biological scientists said, well, maybe this is when the baby's in the womb and the mother is exposed to a certain virus, and that's what we believe is the case. But when people weren't thinking scientifically about this, they said what? What was the cause of schizophrenia, according to the old way of thinking? It's called double bind. Double bind, that if you were told, I love you, I hate you, you know, and that drove you crazy. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. Gracias. Okay. Ojalá que oh, it's good, better, huh? Let's see. Very good. Gracias para la energía. Okay. So, something, I think this is effective. I don't think it's the batteries. I think, yeah, something is not going. So in schizophrenia, you had people being told they were being given double binds, and that their mind was exploding because they were told, I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you. Totally not true. Now, we have to make sure to be very careful because bipolar disorder, manic depressive illness, and schizophrenia, while they're this is better. Hello. This is working? Let's see. Okay, that's it. What did you do? Just change the channel? Oh, fantastic. Okay, gracias. Okay, that was good. Okay, so with schizophrenia, the idea of a double bind is what was said, and that created so much guilt in parents who were not causing this. It was bad enough you had a child who had trouble with their thinking and were not consistent with the reality, and now you were told it was your fault. So how horrible is that, right? So we have to be very careful. So when I was trained in pediatrics, we were never supposed to ask about abuse or anything, because by 1982, 83, we realized the mistakes that people in psychiatry had made by saying parents were causing autism and parents were causing schizophrenia, and they weren't. It was a terrible, terrible violation of trust, really. So we want to be very mindful that what we're talking about is mental health and mental unhealth, no matter what the cause is. So as we go through these research evidence to look at this basic proposal, integration leads to health, don't worry so much about cause. Let's just talk about what exists. So in autism, for example, which is not caused by what parents do, the major finding in the brain is impaired integration. There's a lack of differentiation in a child with autism's brain. For some reason, the brain stops differentiating around 18 months of age. We don't know why. And children with autism have larger brains. They're just not differentiating. So when we say impaired integration in autism, that's where the difficulty is. In schizophrenia, you see impaired linkage in the brain. That it looks like it starts in areas of the brain that are growing in utero, probably from the viral infection. So impaired linkage. In bipolar disorder, you see impaired linkage between, if we take our hand model of the brain, it would go like this. So if you take your thumb in the middle and put your fingers over the top, we'll be referring to this a little bit now. This would be in your head like this, right? And so you have the top of the brain is called the cortex. The middle is a simplified view. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but the middle area is a limbic area. We left and right. The cortex is left and right. And the brainstem, which does not have left and right, it's down here in your palm. And then the spinal cord would be coming up through your wrist in the model, right? So the input from the body to the brain is much larger. Some people say 80% comes as information from the body up to the brain. That's the brain back to the body. But it's also coming through the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve. So we'll just remember that with the wrist too. So in bipolar disorder, this area just behind your forehead is called the prefrontal cortex, and the ventral lateral prefrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex are involved in sending signals down to the amygdala. And these areas are insufficient in bipolar disorder. And they probably are insufficient in childhood, but then during adolescence, instead of the brain just accumulating more and more connections, it starts to remove those connections and brain remodeling in adolescence. And that's probably the reason why the majority of mental illnesses begin in adolescence, because of this pruning process. So vulnerabilities are exposed. So that's where the linkage is deficient in bipolar disorder. Now, those are disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and autism, not caused by what parents do. What would be an example of a disorder that is caused by parents or other caregivers? Traumas, right. So there's a broad term called developmental trauma that includes two kinds: neglect, where the kid is just not connected to, which would be a relational impairment in linkage, right? So that's relational linkage is impaired, neglect. And the other is abuse: physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, right? So we have abuse, we have neglect. Both of those put together are called developmental trauma. So if you look at the research, for example, of Martin Teicher, Teicher, and McLean Hospital, what Marty has shown is that whether it's neglect or abuse, developmental trauma leads to impaired integration in the brain. So I'm going to give you 4 ways that scientists measure that. So tonight, when you go to that party and you talk about integration being health, and someone says, "Oh, that's ridiculous," you are ready to say why it's not ridiculous. Okay, so if you take your hand model of the brain, the first major integrative region that we can study is the differentiated left and differentiated right side of the brain. They're very different from each other. They work together, but what allows them to work together if they're physically separated is the tissue that links them. And what's the name of that tissue? Exactly, the cuerpo calloso, the corpus callosum. That is impaired in its growth with developmental trauma. So that would be a linkage problem. See, corpus, impaired. Oh, impaired. What's the science, the Spanish word for impaired? Dañado? Dañado. Gracias. Okay, so that would be the corpus callosum, number 1. Another area, if you take your hand model of the brain, would be here in your thumb. It's called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is an area that is linking widely differentiated memory systems to each other. That is impaired in its growth. So that's another example of linkage being impaired. Number 3, the prefrontal cortex, right here behind your forehead, it's linking the cortex, so energy and information flow from the cortex, the limbic area, the brainstem, the body, and the social world. So for Alisa, for her to be now interacting at 2 months of age, what's happening is her prefrontal cortex is very underdeveloped because she's 2 months. As she's going to move towards, say, 9 months and 10 months, 11 months, all of these beautiful ways her mom is present, attuned, and resonating with Alisa, they're going to grow her prefrontal cortex in an integrative way. But if she were experiencing developmental trauma, it wouldn't happen. So, again, linkage is impaired with developmental trauma. So let's name the 3 we've done so far. The corpus callosum, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. Then in recent times, people have developed a new way of studying the differentiated areas and how they're linked. And the word in English is the connectome. I don't know how you say that in Spanish, I have no idea. But it would be C-O-N-N-E-C-T, like connect, and then ome. So the connectome is, maybe there's, we'll just use that word, that's a scientific word. We don't have that word in English either. So this is the science word. So connectome means the very small, yeah, you want us to close the door? There's very small differentiated regions throughout the brain and how they're connected to each other. We can now study them. We couldn't do that before. And one of the major findings that Martin Teicher and others have found is the linkages among these very vastly differentiated, separated areas is impaired. So in the 4 ways you could study it, corpus callosum, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the connectome, you see impaired integration because of impaired linkage. Each of those are examples of the neural substrate, the neural basis. When we say that integration is health, you need an integrated brain, but you can see that in abuse and neglect are huge examples of impaired relational integration. So again, our statement is relational integration, like Elisa is experiencing Clemente. They're going to develop integrated brains because they have integrated relationships. Energy information flow that's happening in the relational field that's integrative is going to stimulate integration within the body. And we can call it the embodied brain. And it's actually that simple. So I had 18 interns work with me to revise the textbook that called The Developing Mind into its 3rd edition. And I said, this is too simple. You have to show me one piece of evidence that shows it's wrong. And they go, you mean one piece of evidence that shows it's right? I said, no. Show me one that shows it's wrong. And then let's do something new. You know, they couldn't find anything except information over and over again that this seems to be the basis of health. Whether it's caused by experience, like trauma, or not caused by experience, the common ground of impaired mental health is impaired neural integration, brain integration. Then in 2015, Smith and colleagues came up with a study that showed if you took every measure of well-being they could find, mental health, physical health, the way you were with your diet and nutrition or smoking, not smoking, all these things, you took every measure. One brain factor predicted well-being, and that was how integrated your connectome was. So far, and I say this very carefully because this could be proved to be wrong later on, but so far, every single study of mental unhealth is associated with impaired integration, and every study of health that's been done with the brain associated with integration. Let's look at one more example. I don't know how it is here in Chile, but in the United States, people have become very interested in mindfulness meditation. You know, here too, you know, which can be defined as training that involves 3 aspects to it. You strengthen attention. You strengthen attention, the ability to focus attention. You strengthen the ability to open awareness. So instead of just being aware of something, you open, I'll put open there, you open awareness. Attention becomes focused. And the third thing is you develop kind intention. So these are 3 aspects of the mind. Intention, awareness, and attention are basically things related to energy and information flow. And when your attention becomes focused in its training, your awareness becomes open in its training, and your intention becomes kind in the training. Some people would call the first 2 mindfulness, and they would say mindfulness and compassion training. Other people say all 3 are mindfulness. So when I was meeting with the researchers in this field, they couldn't agree. So I said, okay, I got to call it something because I'm always teaching. So I just call this 3-pillar mind training. 3 pillars meaning here's one pillar, here's another pillar, here's another pillar. And whether you want to call it mindfulness or mindfulness compassion, that's fine. You can call it whatever you want. But this is being very specific. When you do a meta study of all the studies that have been done on these 3 pillars, guess what? They lead to integration in the brain. And I'm not making this up when I tell you they lead to growth of the corpus callosum. You tell me what you think of that. Growth of the hippocampus, growth of the prefrontal cortex, and integration of the connectome. The 4 ways we can study integration that are impaired in trauma are actually grown with 3-pillar mind training. So if someone says, well, what good is this? Now we know integration is health, but there's nothing I can do to promote it. Wrong. There is something you can do to promote it. Here it is, right here. Train attention to be focused, awareness to be open, and intention to be kind. And you will grow integration rate. Now, what people haven't done is taken either that group of individuals with trauma and done the mindfulness training, the 3-pillar mind training. No one's done that yet. Or take people with schizophrenia or people with manic depressive illness. Someone tried to do it in our institution, it didn't work, but for people who are in their 30s. So what you want to do is take people in their adolescence before they had decades of a disorder. So we don't know if it doesn't work as a preventative measure. So in essence, then, what we're saying is that we now have a definition of the mind. And by saying that the mind is a regulatory process, what you can leave our talk today with is to say that to make the mind strong, let me see where I can put this so I don't have to erase anything. To make the mind strong, you are going to have to strengthen the ability to monitor and to modify. So if tonight someone is asking you about this at the party you go to, you say, well, you can teach people how to strengthen their attention. What you're strengthening is their ability to monitor. What's the word in Spanish for monitor? Observar? Monitor? Okay. To monitor and then modify. And what do we mean by integrate? What we mean by modify is to integrate. You're going to teach them to change, modificar, to change how energy information is being integrated. So if you're a therapist hearing what we're talking about, then what you do from this point is say, okay, my job is to work with my individual or a couple or a family or a group, and I have to teach them to monitor with more stability so that they strengthen their attention, and instead of being lost in what they're paying attention to, they have the ability to open awareness so that they distinguish the experience of being aware from that which they're aware of. And I'll give you an example in a moment. And kindness, kind intention. Intention is setting the directional way in which energy and information will be flowing. That's what intention is. It sets a direction, right? Attention guides the energy and information flow. Awareness is the knowing of that flow. So it's all related to energy and information flow. And I'll show you one example of doing that in a school. Any questions now about this? Because I'm going to erase this stuff and show you one more thing. Yes, question?
I have a friend on Zoom who
Yeah.
has a question.
Oh, a friend, great, a Zoom question.
Yeah, she says,
This is great.
how do you think that child development is influenced by parents abusing screens? So what effect do you think that parents being connected to their phone during so much time instead of interacting with their
Yeah,
kids?
it would block linkage, wouldn't it? Totally. Right. I see this all the time. Oh my God, we live near a school, and there's a mother taking her kids to school in her stroller, and instead of talking to her kid who's facing her, she's busy on her phone doing this. The kid is just spacing out, and they're learning to parents who aren't really there. Yeah, it's very serious. Yeah, so kids are not having the linkage. So again,
You're not having that with Clemente.
no, you can see the difference, yeah, right? So we have two great examples of parents who are really tuned in, and you came here to hear about attunement while you're also being attuned to your kids. So Clemente and Alicia, we want to get the pictures of their wedding going. That's later on. Okay, so any other questions about this before I erase it?
Yeah,
Oh, another Zoom question. Great.
They are asking if you can measure the integration, the patient or individual.
If you do the brain studies, you can actually measure integration in these ways of studying corpus callosum, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the connectome. You can also study what are called gamma waves, which are high. When the brain becomes very integrated, it shows certain electrical activity. You can do it another way in terms of just observing things as a clinician. You can basically, we have a training program at the Mindset Institute, and you're welcome to come join us, where you learn how to do clinical assessment based on chaos or rigidity, which is an inference about impaired integration. And then as people get better in the integrated work you do, I'll give you one example of that. We have 9 domains of integration we work with, and then you see that chaos and rigidity start to disappear. And they start to stop impairing a person's life. Yeah, so you can measure it clinically, you can have an assessment of it, you can measure it in the brain too. We're trying to figure out how to measure it in a classroom, and it's not that easy, but we're trying to figure that out. How do you measure integration in a relational field? That's, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So with mindfulness training, you can train the working kind intention, and you're working in that way with the linkage, the third linkage.
Yeah, so what's the kindness training? Let me walk you through a practice that does that, and then you can do it on our website. That gives you exactly what that is. But our saying at the Mindset Institute is kindness and compassion are integration made visible. So when you see someone being kind, they are linking, and in the linking, they're also differentiating. How are you feeling? I want to know how you're doing. You're suffering. I'm going to help you. You're having a great thing going on. I want to take joy in your joy. So empathic resonance and empathic joy and empathic concern, the concern is the gateway for compassion. And when you do this with a state of positive regard, we call it kindness. And when we honor each other's vulnerability, that's kindness. So when you look at all the different definitions of kindness, it's integration. I mean, the kindness researchers don't use the word, no one uses the concept of integration. But for me, maybe I'm just a simpleton, it's kindness is integration. And so when you cultivate that internally, then you're allowing integration to naturally arise. Yes?
So I have a question from your book, The Whole Brain Child. I remember you talking about like integrating.
Okay, actually, let me give you this for the Zoom people.
Okay.
You okay?
Yeah. So I have a question about your book, The Whole Brain Child. You talk about integrating the left and the right part of the brain and the upper and the lower brain, and being able to kind of, as a parent, help your kid through that through strategies like, for example, in the book you talked about a baby who got in a car accident with her caretaker, right, and how it's important for the mom or the dad to actually talk to her about that experience afterwards, verbalize it, and kind of review it with her so that she doesn't just live the traumatic experience and then let's never talk about it again. And then maybe she's going to have trauma with driving in cars, but actually talk about it with her, verbalize it, even though she might not even talk yet, but be able to integrate those experiences and those sides of the brain. I'm wondering if that's connected also to this integration that you're talking about.
Completely. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, the 6 parenting books I wrote, the first one was Parenting from the Inside Out with Mary Hartzell, and it was taking the research finding that the best predictor of how a child will develop secure attachment is not what happened to the parent themselves, which is what people thought. It's actually how they made sense, revealed in a story that they tell to a researcher of what happened to them. So when I heard that in the 80s, I went, wow, that's amazing. Research that shows that making sense of your life, thinking about what happened in the past, feeling the sense of it, and then making sense of it frees you from what's also true, which is if you had a really bad past and you don't make sense of it, you're very likely to repeat it with your child, right? So that was an amazing finding. So that was parenting from the inside out. Then I was giving a lecture, and one of the students in the lecture hall was really excited, and she had a 6-month-old there with her, and so she became my co-author, Tina Payne Bryson, and we wrote 4 books together. She had 3 sons who all grew up using this model that we're talking about here. So my kids got too old to let me write about them in the books. They said, you're not allowed to do that anymore. But Tina's kids didn't say that. So we don't say that publicly, but anyway. So together, we wrote these 4 books. But they're all basically taking the developing mind, the graduate school textbook, The Developing Mind, and translating that for parents, through the lens of actually being a father and a mother, in different families. So the whole brain child, does that, and it basically says to the parent, your job is to be an integrator. So parenting from the inside out, do that first, because if you didn't have integration in your childhood, it's okay, but do the work to integrate yourself now. So making sense of traumatic experiences, integrating them. So that's the inside out stuff. And then what we did was said, well, now that you've done that, now we'll talk about what you do actually with your kid. Whole brain child, no drama discipline, the yes brain, and the power of showing up. Those are all basically taking the developing mind research summaries and then saying, let's translate this for parents. And then I wrote a book for adolescents themselves to integrate their own brains. So rather than being for parents could read it, but it's actually written for adolescents, called Brainstorm. And what adolescents do then is they take responsibility for themselves and say, okay, here are exercises for me to integrate my own life. Yeah. So any other questions before I'll give you just one example to show you how this works. Okay, is it okay if I erase this? Okay, so let's do this. So when I was in that wonderful meeting with those 40 scientists, and I gave them this definition of mind that we now have, that we talked about, they were very excited, and 40 of them said, I can go with that. And we met for 4.5 years. And I learned how important it was to get the perspective from other disciplines. And that's a process in English, an old English word called consilience. We use CONSILIENCE. Consilience means, what does anthropology say? What does sociology say? What does linguistics say? What does psychology say? What does biology say? Chemistry, physics, what do indigenous teachings say? What do we learn from contemplative practice? What is religion saying? What do we learn from music? We try to bring everybody in. We have now 75 textbooks that I've overseen. I'm the editor of this series. So there's a lot of books if you want to read them in the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology. That's what it's called. The Home for Interpersonal Neurobiology is where Caroline and I work at the MindSight Institute. So you can join us online. We have lots of ways to continue learning. But we always take a conciliant approach, saying our view is that there's one reality. And if we stay true to the deep nature of that reality, then everyone trying to explore it, if you're a musician or a poet or a person who's meditating for years, or you're a person from indigenous backgrounds or a scientist of any discipline, it ought to fit together. Why wouldn't it? That's our view. Now, not everyone agrees with that, but that's the stance we take at the MindSight Institute. So I'm also a therapist, in addition to being a dad and a husband and a whatever I am. So in my office, there is a table that has a center like that, and it's a glass center and a wood rim. And I would bring my patients up from the chair or the couch, And I would say, you know, a consilient finding is that integration is health. And another consilient finding is that consciousness is needed for change. So they go, okay, and? So I said, so let's put those two together and let's integrate consciousness. So I'm going to ask you to do this with me, and I'm going to tell you what we've come up with from that. So if consciousness is defined as the experience of knowing that we call awareness, and we put the knowing in the center here, in English, if this were a wheel, you'd call it a hub. So we'll put the knowing of awareness metaphorically in a hub. And then on this rim, we'll put all the knowns, right? And then we'll have a singular spoke that's like what holds up the table that we can move around the rim. So we have three components to this, what we ended up calling the wheel of awareness. Nadie quiere llamarlo la mesa de conocimiento, pero está the wheel. ¿Cómo se dice wheel? Huela? With an R. Uh-oh, here's my R challenge. Huela. Oh, rueda. 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 Like that. Rueda. Okay, done that a long time. Okay, so that's the rim. This is the spoke right there. Spoke. Okay. So we separate awareness in the hub from what you're aware of on the rim, and then we can divide the rim up into 4 segments. And each of these represents energy flow. So the first segment would be the first 5 senses, right? And that's basically sound, sight, smell, taste, touch. Then we have the interior of the body, signals, which in science we actually call the 6th sense. So that's like the feeling in your muscles, your bones, your heart, your lungs, things like that. Then you have here, you would have in this 3rd segment, mental activities like thoughts and feelings or emotions, activities. And then here you even have your relational sense, your connection. So the people and to the planet. And I'll just tell you 2 quick stories. We'd move the spoke around the rim, and then in an advanced practice, we would actually take the spoke and aim it right into the hub, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So in a kindergarten class, a teacher said, because we teach this in the whole brain child, that she teaches this to 5-year-olds. And a boy had been kicked out of one school because he beat up another boy on the playground. And he was transferred to another school. So a terrible experience on that at first school. And now she had him in her classroom. So let's name him Billy. Or let's, yeah. So Billy learns the wheel as a drawing, not as a meditation, but just as a drawing. And the day after he learns it, she writes me an email about this. He comes into her during the recess. She's in the classroom doing notes, and he says, Miss Smith, you need to give me a break because I'm on the playground and I'm about to hit Joey because he took my box. And then he goes, I'm lost on my rim. I need to get back to my hub. So she gives him a break, and he uses this visual image of the mind to monitor his impulses to hit the other boy, to that basically he was strengthening his ability to focus attention, to then go into open awareness, to say, I need to distinguish awareness from the thing I'm aware of, So even though I have an impulse to hit Joey, I don't. That's the difference between being a president or being in prison. In many ways, right? So your ability to sit in the hub, although some presidents don't get it. Anyway, I won't use that example again. Anyway, in general, that's the example of being present or not. And so in this way, he was able to use just a visual image to differentiate the knowing of consciousness from the known. He was integrating consciousness, differentiating them and linking them. He could say to his teacher, this is what I'm feeling. So I started doing this with patients, and they had anxiety or mild to moderate depression, or they were facing panic because they were given a medical diagnosis of dying. And this was helpful for all those things. And then very carefully used, it was helpful for people who were trying to make sense of abuse and neglect. So then I started doing it in workshops, and I did it in workshops before the pandemic. First with the first 10,000 people in person, like in rooms like this, recorded when people took the microphone and said, this is what I experienced. And then we went up to 50,000 people in person I did this with. And then a certain percentage of them would take the microphone or write me notes about what it was like. And I just want to share with you before we conclude in a few minutes, one of the findings from that survey. When people would go around, they would say, I started hearing things more clearly, seeing things with more vividness. My appreciation for what was going on inside of my body was more. I could distinguish different mental activities like feelings, memories, thoughts. I could, not be swept up by a thought or whatever. I started appreciating my connections to people and to nature more, which are all beautiful things. And then in turning this spoke around or just retracting the spoke to, or some people prefer not bending it, but just keeping it in here or having no spoke at all, just being in the hub. Here's what came up over and over again. People would talk about three things. They'd drop into pure awareness, and they would talk about the feeling of being connected to everything. Like I did this in a parliament once. They were having a lot of conflicts, so they had me spend the day with the parliamentarians, do the wheel of awareness as a meditation. And during the break, one of the parliamentarians comes to me and he says, I didn't speak during the sharing time. And I said, yeah, I noticed you weren't talking. Do you want to know why I didn't talk? Sure, I'd like to know why. And then he gets very quiet. He goes, you know the part of the wheel when you bend the spoke around? I said, yeah, I know that part. And he goes, now he's crying. He says, I have never felt so much love before in my life. I have never felt, I was connected to everyone and everything. And I was crying. And there's the silence. I said, so you didn't want to share that? Because that's often what people say, actually. In other settings, not in parliaments, but other settings, people share that. Say, I felt so much love, I was connected. Love, 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 love. All the time connected in this open awareness. So I said, so you didn't want to share it? He goes, oh, no. I said, well, because he goes, oh, he points over to his colleagues. He goes, if I said love to them, they would think I was weak. So then I said, okay, you don't want to look weak. He goes, no. I said, so when you make national law, when you're making federal policy, are you leaving love out of your reasoning? And then his eyes got really, really big, and his finger came up. And he ran over and started talking to his colleagues. I don't know what they said. But we can only hope they would start leading their government with love. Because love looks like, from all these findings, it's actually the fabric, not only of consciousness, but the fabric of the universe. That when people tap into this open, spacious place, It's what indigenous teachings have taught us for thousands of years. It's what contemplative practices have taught us for thousands of years. And now this is just a systematic application to over 50,000 people of this simple practice to differentiate the knowing of consciousness from the known. And what pops up in the knowing is connection, open awareness, and love, which is your final acronym of the day, COAL, right? It's another way of using it. So connected, open awareness, and love, you know? And this is just this really incredible finding that if you speak to indigenous elders about the practices that have been passed for thousands of years, if you speak to people who've been meditating in extensive ways in various religious traditions, spiritual traditions, or if you look at ultimately what this is like the place where integration arises. When people are given the opportunity to not be lost in all the ways trauma or other ways they've not integrated keeps them stuck on the rim, they access connection, open awareness, and love. And you can do this as a therapist. You can do this with yourself. Just come to our website. You know, people have been doing the wheel now for a long time from the website. And when you do it, you'll have your own experience of building basically this practice. Even though it was built to integrate consciousness, it has the three pillars in it. All in one practice that teaches you to strengthen attention in the first two segments. It opens awareness when you look at this segment, the third segment, and you bend this book around, and it builds relational connections and kindness in this fourth segment. So in a way, you get the three pillars all in the wheel of awareness practice, and you get this opportunity to drop into the hub. The last thing I would just say, in a book called Aware and another book called Becoming Aware, there's a whole thing we haven't gotten into today, which this will have to be for another time, but we've said that the mind is an emergent, self-organizing, embodied relational process that's regulating the flow of energy and information, right? You all got that? Okay, well, we've said it, but the mind is an embodied and relational, self-organizing, emergent property of basically a complex system that is regulating the flow of energy and information. So a healthy mind is a mind that is promoting integration. And you can do this in yourself, you can do this in your clients, your patients, by teaching them to integrate consciousness. You're giving them the opportunity to strengthen the health of their mind because you're promoting this integrative capacity, right? But what I want to say, and I'll conclude with this, is that we actually didn't say what energy is. So if you read the book Mind or read the book Aware, or please come to our website and you can join us. We have a whole community of people who are coming now. And in fact, I think I even spoke in Chile 2 weeks ago. Were any of you on that talk I did? And everyone said, oh, we want to join. So there may actually be a Chilean or South American group that is going to start, but you can join us because we go deeply into what energy is. And then when you start to work with energy from a physics point of view, it's mind-blowingly exciting because then you start to really get into the subtleties of, you know, this is a metaphor, but what's the actual mechanism beneath the wheel of awareness? So if you want to just read a book about that, the book Aware, I think that's in Spanish, but I'm not sure if it's in Spanish yet. I think it is. But certainly the book Mind is, and that goes through it. But this is a metaphor that's very useful. You can actually dive into what energy is and then how to work with that. So I want to thank you for you taking the energy to be here today. I'm honored to be spending the morning with you, and muchísimas gracias.
This morning, it's a pleasure to have you here. Y para quienes nos acompañan, muchas gracias por haber estado esta mañana acá. Los agradecimientos van también a todas las personas que nos acompañaron por Zoom. A quienes están acá en forma presencial, los invitamos a un café en la terraza del café. Si no entran afuera, podemos ir juntos para que les podamos mostrar. Muchas gracias nuevamente y que tengan un buen día.
I did studies, I go to my other mother
Oh, wonderful.
and really,